What's going on, everybody? Happy Wednesday. Happy new comic book day. This is Brandon from Comics Kings. Welcome, everybody, to the Kingdom, or welcome back if this isn't your first time. But make sure you guys hit the like button on your way in. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. We are here today to talk about a great book, great indie book over at AWA, written by John Lees. John, thank you so much for being here, sir. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me. I'm just floored there by that epic, rousing opening sequence that we had
Yeah.
for the show there. Some dramatic music playing. Yeah, no, it's been good. Obviously today's been my release day for the Crimson Cage, so it's been a lot of promo. I went and did a in-store signing out at a shop in Glasgow today. That was a lot of fun. It's my first in-store signing I've done since 2019, so like, it was nice to kind of get back out in a shop again. Yeah, no, it was fun.
Yeah, since the world kind of ended, I'm glad you're out and about now. You know, I feel like we're kind of in this age where we're kind of in the pandemic, kind of over the pandemic, but we're still kind of venturing out.
Yeah,
So,
like it's one of these things where like I don't think we're almost at the most dangerous point of the pandemic, because it's not like it's any less infectious or like any less dangerous. But now we're all kind of like we've waited enough. Let's just go out,
right.
So like I say, I'm trying my best to be careful. Still, I'm very much the guy who's still going around wearing like a mask and like hand sanitizer constantly, and keep my distance.
Right.
But yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of slowly getting back out of there. Like I did my first convention last month now at Thought Bubble, and I'm hopefully maybe going to get back out to the US again next year. Just take it slowly but surely.
Yeah, definitely try to make your way over to Baltimore. That was a great show. It was really well done. Everyone was safe. That's kind of where I am, so that's why I'm like, come out to Baltimore.
Yeah, no, I've heard good things about Baltimore. I know, like my friend Tyler James, who runs Comics Tribe, he's been a Baltimore stalwart for many years, and I'm sure Alex Cormack, who's the artist on the Crimson Cage and my other book Sync, I'm sure he's done the Baltimore a few times as well. They've all said good things about it, so maybe one of these days I'll get out and visit.
Oh yeah, Baltimore is the best show in the world. If anyone would like to argue, my DMs are always open. We can have that conversation.
I'll put a case forward for Glasgow Comic Con here in Scotland.
But welcome everybody in the chat. If you guys do have a question for John, make sure you type it in the comments below. Right here in this chat. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's video. We are with the PCB Army Bad Batch today. It's Whiplash Wednesday. That means that I dropped a video at 1 o'clock talking about our top 10 MCU movies with Stefan, Missing Link. And then we had Nick Comic Culture dropping 2 videos today as well. Big Herm has a show right after this, followed by Manny. We also had Travis on today with chatting with the comic community with Werner from the Cerebros. Lots of great content that came out today from us. So make sure you guys catch those rewind if you were not in the live chat, you did not catch us on any of those replays. But John, tell us a little bit about HOTELL. I know no one wants to hear me speak today, so how about you give us the pitch?
Well, HOTELL is a horror anthology series set in an old roadside hotel off Route 66. Officially, it doesn't exist. You won't find it on any map, but if you're driving alone and you're truly desperate for sanctuary or secrecy, perhaps you'll find a sign on the edge of the road saying next exit on the left, and it'll take you to Pierrot Courts. But once you get there, you might wish you'd kept on driving. So the basic premise is like each chapter is its own self-contained story, a little kind of like spooky tale, but they all kind of connect to form a larger whole. The first volume, which we launched last year, I think literally the week it came out was the week the comic industry shut down. So great timing.
Right.
But yeah, like the initial premise of volume 1 was it was all set over like a single day. It was like the day of like I think it was a solar eclipse, and each issue was like the perspective of like a different room and a different room's experience of like these same events, like when you were seeing different things happening. So, for example, spoiler alert for anyone who's not read Volume 1, stop, like, cover your ears if you don't want to hear. But like, for example, like in issue 1, you had the main stories about this woman who is like a pregnant woman on the run. And like she's having these weird dreams about like from her babies talking to her and telling her to start doing terrible things, and she starts to realize it might not actually be her baby. But there's like a little scene in that where she bumps into like the guy who's staying in room 2, and he's kind of flirting with her and being a bit of a creep. And then the hotel room door opens to room 2, and it's his wife there, and he looks horrified to see his wife. And like the main character from issue 1's like, oh, busted, and he
Right.
goes in. And then in issue 2, you learn that he's horrified to see his wife because before that happened, he'd just killed her and disposed of her body. And then he went back to the hotel and she's there.
Sitting right there.
Yeah.
She's sitting right there.
Like, so it's little things like that, like kind of like, so it's like little connections that form a larger whole. So with volume 2, which you've just launched, like I say, it came out in shops last week. We definitely didn't want to do like just more of the same. We didn't want to be, oh, another eclipse happened, So we decided to make it like a bigger scale. Like this takes place over like a week, and it's like you have more comings and goings and more people kind of checking out and checking in. And then the kind of like overarching story is this external threat to the hotel, which is gradually getting closer. But until that threat arrives, you have like some really kind of like one of some of our most ambitious, like scary tales yet. Like the first chapter that just came out is a story about a family who are kind of like looking for a fresh start, and they all go to stay in the hotel together. And like, the dark forces there are kind of like attacking all of their weaknesses, and the only way they're going to survive is if they come together. But we don't know if they're going to come together or kind of crumble apart. So yeah, like it's fun because like I love working in an anthology format because like you get to tell like all kinds of different types of stories. Like some of them are more serious, some of them are a bit silly. But there's like one coming up which was like really emotional, like which I wasn't expecting when I started doing Hotel. But yeah, no, like it's a really fun book to work on. Like one of the things I've said is like I've said this before, but I always have high expectations, high hopes for any book I work on. But I think I was taken aback by just how much like people really responded to Hotel. People really seemed to love this book, and I think the reason I'm here talking to you now about Volume 2 is because of all the people that took to Twitter, took to Instagram, saying when's Volume 2 coming out. Tagging me, tagging AWA, saying like we want more. So you let people know. You let everyone know that you wanted more, and now we're doing it. So thanks for getting the word out there and being undeniable.
Right. Oh no, it's my pleasure at all. That's why you're here, is to keep pushing this forward. I love AWA, so I'm really excited that that we've been able to do this with a lot of the creators. If anyone missed the Greg Hurwitz interview, that was also a lot of fun. Go check that out because Knighted #2 also came out today.
Yeah, Knighted #2 came out today as well.
So I've read both of them. I've read of everything that AWA has put out this past 2 weeks, and it's phenomenal. So this is really cool because I'm not the biggest. I'm gonna be very honest. I'm not the biggest anthology series. It was really hard for me to get into Ice Cream Man, for example. But this was really unique because I think what this does differently from most anthology books is that it ties together in a more fluid sense. It's like you don't need to read every issue, but if you are, you'll just like get the fluidness of the series.
Yeah, that's definitely something I enjoy, like having that whole idea of like, you're rewarding long-term readership, even if you don't necessarily have to read every issue. If you do, you'll get even more out of it.
Right, 100%. And I thought that was especially really well done. What drew you to put the hotel setting into place? I'm really curious about that.
Well, I was actually down to a couple of things. Like way back, this is going back to like 2018. When I first met Axel Alonso, the editor-in-chief of AWA Studios,
right.
like he'd followed me on Twitter, and I was like, someone pretending to be Axel Alonso's followed me on Twitter, but no, it was the actual Axel Alonso, and he was like, I'm a big fan of Sync, which was my earlier comic I'd done, and he's like, I'd love to like chat to you about working together on something. So at the time I said to him like, yeah, I'm about to leave for New York Comic Con, but once I get home we can set up like a Skype call or something. And he was like, no, I'm based in New York, so if you're coming out to New York, we can go out for lunch, we can meet in person. So I ended up going to meet Axel for lunch at some little restaurant, like, 2 days before the show started. And like he was telling me about like he said he was going to be launching a new company which would become AWA. And he was saying that like, he's been looking at like, like bringing in some exciting new creators, and like he would really like to see what I have. And it's like, what ideas have you got? So, like, based on our conversation at that first meeting, like the things he talked about to me, as he said, he loves like anthologies. He liked the anthology vibe of Sync, and like, to have any more anthology ideas. he said, "Do you have anything else with clowns in it?" It was just like evil killer clowns. Singing. I was thinking the last thing I want to do is like another clown story, but I
Is
thought,
it like a clone saga, but with AWA?
a clown is in like ha ha ha, like white face paint clowns.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, clown. I thought you said
Yeah.
clone. I thought you said clone for a second. I was like,
Oh no, clowns. As far as his accent, but yeah, no, like so. Like it said, like do you want to, like, have you got anything else with clowns in it? And like I had like a, like in sync. There's this big kind of blue van with kind of like murderous clowns that drive around snatching people. And I thought the last thing I want to do is more clowns. So I thought of a totally different type of clown for this story. And then the other thing he said was, he'd said, I love the setting of like an old roadside hotel. And he was thinking like in the context of like a crime story, like, or a noir, like, where a gangster holds up in a hotel or something. But because like I do horror, my mind instantly went to horror and what kind of scary stories could you do there. And I started thinking about, like, I think hotels are inherently creepy places, like a lot of the time. Like at one point, I was staying at a hotel in New York, and I was like I was in the bathroom getting ready, and I looked across, and like there was a mirror in the living room, that I could see from inside the bathroom, and reflected in the mirror was the bed in the in the hotel room, and the bed was like one of those ones where it's like what you can see underneath the bed, and there's obviously just an empty space. But I had this thought of how creepy would it be if you saw somebody like underneath the bed looking out at you from in there, like, and then and that kind of thought stayed in my head, and then I started thinking like all kinds of other scary things you could do in a hotel, and I think for me, it's like, I think it's a twist on a haunted house premise. Like haunted houses, you tend to think of as like these big old manors, like but it's like taking that old idea of a haunted house and blending it with like modern Americana, like the roadside hotel.
right.
I thought was an interesting kind of tension to play with.
100%. 100%. I thought was really, really cool about this book was it was in the perspective, not really, but with the doorman, right? The first person you greet.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's gonna see like a bunch of different people, right?
Yeah.
Why do you go to a hotel? You can be there for a sporting event. You can be there for a Comic-Con event. You can be there because you had to get away from someone. You can be there because you want to be with someone, or you're just there for you're going on a road trip. You need somewhere to crash. So like you get so many stories, so many different adventures. So I thought that kind of perspective was really, really unique. And I was like, I never thought about it. I was like, this guy probably has stories for days. You think about how many people you interact with in your daily life, and it's like, this guy's seen people from all over the world, and everyone has their own skeletons. So I thought that was a really cool highlight right there.
And especially when you're talking about like hotels in general, but especially if you're talking about like little hotels off the side of the road, because those aren't places that like you're booking and you're staying there for 2 weeks or whatever. Like that's like
no, you're in and out.
like you're there and gone, like so
Right.
it's all kinds of lives that are kind of drifting in and out here, and I thought it was a fascinating kind of setting. And in terms of like our doorman character, our concierge, Jack Lynch, with him, I was very much thinking of like a crypt keeper type figure, or like Rod Sterling, like or Rod Serling did the Twilight Zone, like that kind of idea of the host that kind of like comes and says like, "Hello, everybody, here's our story."
I was thinking he was more like the guy in Aladdin who like introduced the whole movie. The guy with the lamp at first. I was like singing Arabian Nights. I was like, that's kind of who I thought he was at first. I was like,
that works as well, so I just, but also I thought like one of the fun things we get to do is in volume 1, that was pretty much his role. He was like, "Hello, everybody, and here's the story for today." But in volume 2, he becomes more of an active participant in the story. Like over the course of this volume, he's going to get more woven in, and we're going to get to do interesting things and explore a little bit about who he is and like what makes him tick and like why is he there in the hotel. So it's gonna like, and we're going to be kind of like digging into like the structure of the the place and the hidden corners of the hotel more. So we're kind of peeling back the layers a little bit this volume. So that's going to be fun.
Oh, 100%. By the way, you're getting a lot of love in the comments from everyone saying like they loved Hotel Volume 1. They can't wait for the second. Well, the first issue, the second volume did come out.
Yeah, you can get issue 1 in shops now. So thanks very much for all your support and for your patience as we got volume 2 out. So I hope you enjoyed volume 2
it's been really hard this pandemic, right? Especially because a lot of editors now try to push up all the books, and I noticed like a lot of indie companies will delay them, while like the big two just rush everything to the forefront.
Yeah, I mean,
So
like, I know with the pandemic hit a lot of publishers hard. Like, I'm sure like Axel and Co have talked about this in like interviews and things, but like I said before, their big massive launch event it was like 4 titles. It was Hotel, it was The Resistance, it was Archangel 8, it was Red Border, it was 4 comics. It was going to be like massive launch event. It was going to be like signings like in the UK and in the US. It was like a big massive thing.
like a big worldwide thing.
Aye, and then that was the week that like the pandemic hit, and none of these
Yeah.
books, like and like and like obviously like they were in a stage where like they didn't know what the future was going to be. I mean, I remember we're going to talk about the Crimson Cage in a minute, but like with the Crimson Cage, we'd been working on a contract for that for quite a while. There'd been quite a lot of back and forth and discussion, and we finally signed on the dotted line. Me and Alex Cormack, the artist, we signed in February 2020, and I actually messaged Alex and said, right, unless something crazy happens that like brings the world as we know it to a halt, this book's definitely coming out in 2020. And then like 3 weeks later, like the pandemic hits, and we got the email saying all active projects or all in development projects are going to go on pause until like we know what's happening, like for future. So it ended up being that like what was going to be a 2020 book got put on hold for like that whole year. And it was only like at the end of 2020 they were like, okay, we're ready to go again.
Right.
And that's why it's only coming out now in December 2021. Like,
Right.
I think every publisher probably has a similar story. I heard people's stories from like other places where like their in development books got put on hold simply because like they wanted to make sure they'd get a proper release. They weren't going to get
Right.
put out when
I
comic shops were
know the Dark
closed.
Hold at Marvel,
Yeah.
that Steve Orlando read, that was supposed to come out. That was solicited like what last year, I think. I think it was like
Yeah, no,
announced last year, and I was like,
I-
and we're finally like getting to it. I almost forgot about it if I wasn't
Yeah.
friends with Steve, but I was like, that's awesome
I
that
mean,
it's out. It's a
good.
great story.
Yeah, it's like things are actually finally starting to kind of get back on track, which is good. I'm just relieved that things are kind of like
Right.
rebounded as well. They have.
Right. So something that did come out of the pandemic was kind of a newer, I want to say a fad, but a growing interest in horror comics. Horror comics were always there. We had you had Gideon Falls is already coming out. It was already probably halfway through the pandemic hit. You had, I would say Sweet Tooth is kind of up that area. I'm naming all Jeff Lemire books because that's what I've been reading lately. I'm like, I know other horror books, but like Something is Killing the Children has been coming out since then. I would even say Once and Future has some horror elements.
Yeah, our Department of Truth.
Department of Truth. And then we're
yeah.
going to start naming our Tynan books. But
Nice House in the Lake.
yeah. But what is kind of your perspective on this growing interest in newer comic book readers getting into horror?
Well, I think there's a bunch of different factors. Like you say, like horror's always been around, and like as someone who works in the horror genre and
Yes.
like is a fan of horror, like I've seen like there's been for years there's been plenty of great horror content coming out. But I think you've seen an uptick in horror because I think generally speaking, in times when the real world is like has more anxiety and more things to be afraid of, like fictional horror becomes something of a release where you want to like experience horror that's kind of fictional and contained and it has a nice resolution at the end. It's a kind of escape from the real life horror. I think we're seeing a lot right now. There's a lot of anxiety in the air with like the pandemic and a bunch of other things and I think like people are like want to channel that into like horror on like the screen or on the comics page. And so I think that's why you're seeing a lot of like people kind of like like reacting in that, because I think like for me, horror, as a big horror fan, I would say like horror is like actually one of like the most honest. I'm not a horror movie person, but I love horror comics. Great.
I'm a big horror comic fan. I just can't do horror movies.
I know I love all of it, but like for me, I think horror is one of like the most honest genres because I think through the medium of horror, you can often like talk about the world, in a way that you might not be able to talk about it so easily in like just doing it directly. Because I've said this before, like if you actually go back to like the 1970s, like some of the best, like some of the first like great Vietnam movies were like horror movies, that weren't even about Vietnam. Like you watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre like in 1974, whatever that was, and that's like a Vietnam movie, but it wasn't about Vietnam. But that's like that was obviously like people like expressing their feelings about it through the medium of horror, because like horror operates in such an emotional high level that I think there's a real honesty in there. People really kind of get to kind of tick their subconscious and what's going on, behind the scenes, on the, like a fictional medium.
Right. Yeah, I kind of feel I relate to that a lot. When I think of horror, I think the first person that comes to mind is, or the first thing is kind of like your train of thought is like kind of, we all think thoughts that would be provoked in society, right?
Yeah.
Because we all think like we're trained to think kind of like really messed up things a whole lot of times, but it's like you can't say that in society because there's societal boundaries. If you go outside society, you're kind of weird. That's just like basic human psychology. We all think it, and horror has like this really weird way of turning something that's in everyone's like, that's something that you want to say but you can't. But horror is just a great genre to do it. I recently watched.
I think something like the best horror or some of my favorite horror is always like the stuff that starts off with like something real, like
I liked Alien, and that wasn't anything real, but I loved Alien.
Well, we're not, Alien is all about the working man getting screwed over by big business, saying it's the idea of multinational corporations viewing workers as disposable, like that's what that's all about. It has like a human core to it, and so then you can't, if you just start a horror with if the question is what if a big werewolf was chasing you, that's not like a real issue, but with Hotel, for example, like the first chapter, that's about family and about not being able to trust the people that you love most, and that becomes like a human idea that you can then kind of add monsters and scares into. And I think when you look at some of the best horror, it comes from a human place, and that's what kind of invests you and makes you more scared.
Right. And that's really interesting. Because in this book, it does come from a very human thing. But the other thing that to me is something we all see horror films. There's those big jump scares, but you can't accomplish that in a comic book, right? So it takes a lot of trust with your artist. How do you really go about picking your artist, or is it kind of like a mutual thing, or someone set, or is it editorially set up?
Well, that's kind of like a two-part question. The first thing, in terms of jump scares, I do agree that that's something that horror movies have that comics struggle to replicate. Just in general, sound has such a big impact on horror. No, not just the jump scares. I'm talking about the sound design, the score. And imagine if you were to put on I don't know, The Shining for me is a movie that's one example of how scary that is that it's scary when you don't even have the picture. If you were sitting in the next room and you were listening to The Shining, playing in another room, that you would be terrified because it sounds scary.
Well, this is kind of what I can relate to because I haven't seen many horror movies, but I have seen Jaws, and that sound right before the shark bites you is not something that I liked as a 5-year-old when I watched it, when my parents made me at a beach house, by the way. So I can definitely test to that part of it.
Yeah, no, so sound has a lot of impact. So when comics doesn't have that tool, you think, how do you try and replicate that? And for me, the closest thing that horror has to a jump scare is the page turn reveal, where if you in Junji Ito, who's a manga artist, is great at this, where he'll tease the reveal. You'll see something in the shadows, and you'll see you're getting closer, and then you turn the page and it's something horrific, and you're you turn the shut again, and that's about the closest stuff you can get to a jump scare in comics. But in terms of collaborating with artists, with Hotel, I work with Dalibor Talaic, who is a celebrated artist with many Marvel credits. And for Volume 1, we didn't really work together so much. For Volume 1, it was I wrote the scripts, and then they told me you're working with Dalibor, and gave him the scripts that I'd written, and then he drew them. But at New York Comic Con in 2019, we met for the first time, and we hit it off, and we got on great, became friends. And then that meant that when we started working on Volume 2, I could message Dalibor and say, right, what do you want to draw? Let's talk about it. And so I feel like this volume is much better because it's much more collaborative. We're much more about
it definitely felt like that. That first issue that I've recently read just definitely felt like that. I can agree. Another thing that I've kind of been noticing about horror comics in general, I don't know if you could speak on it, but I think the biggest reason why I would say horror is the most new reader friendly genre right now, simply because it's easier to get invested in characters, a lot of more close knit relationships, but also the panel formatting is much simpler. You're getting a lot of simple layouts out one on top of the other, or it's like a 6-panel, 9-panel grid. Is that intentional when you go to write horror comics, or?
I mean, like, I think, like, nothing. Well, I think that's something probably more like the artist's domain, like the writers. Like, I mean, I don't like when I'm writing a script. I generally don't say, like, do a tidy 6 panel grid, you know. But like, I think that it varies. 'Cause, like, certain books, like Hotel, like that kind of structure and that kind of like contained. Because I think one thing that Dalibor does really well is Dalibor has a very kind of like you say, straightforward, clean, clear visual style,
Right.
which means that when the crazy stuff gets put in there, it's all the more jarring because it's drawn in this kind of really grounded style. So suddenly something nightmarish is intruding into this. But then you have artists like I did a comic called Mountainhead with Ryan Lee, and my script is pretty straightforward for that. I would write like, oh, Abraham looks sad, and like Ryan would just draw these crazy ornate like layouts, and you'd have like,
Right.
blooming crazy things coming out of his head, and like, panels in the shape of teardrops like coming out of his
Right.
head, and, and like, like in like each page was like a tableau. So I think like it varies depending on the artist, like because that's one of the great things about collaboration. Because the artist is like, if like I'm the screenwriter, the artist is like the director, like who's interpreting like my script and kind of like putting it on the page in an interesting
Right.
visual way. And like, sometimes that's like straightforward, or sometimes it's a bit more crazy and out there. Although speaking about crazy layouts, like watch out for issue 2 of Hotel. Dalibor does something really wild in this issue where I don't want to give away the content of the issue, but it's this kind of double page spread where you're following a character like, through this kind of spiraling cascade of like images, and like they turn upside down and the speech bubbles turn upside down, and then like they end up at the bottom of the page, then they kind of crawl through into the next page, and then the layout's kind of going from the bottom of the page to the top, and it's like really kind of wild and out there. So yeah, sometimes we do some crazy stuff in horror as well.
Right on, man. So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about Crimson Cage that came out today. I read it.
Yes.
I read it on my phone because I don't know, my shop, it wasn't in my pull box for some reason. It should have been, but but
Here's the nice print version here.
right. Oh, nice. Yeah. Thanks for the flex, John. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Big man right over here.
Comics, yeah.
Yeah, that's why we're both wearing bulky clothes right now, just to make it appear so much bigger, right?
Yeah. So only bulky clothes can contain all my muscles.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Kind of like those Halloween suits that have like all the fluff in it. The fake six pack that's like really like up here. Okay. But let's talk about the pitch, because I could talk about it all I want.
Yeah.
But again, no one wants to hear me talk today. We're here for you.
Yeah. Okay, well, the pitch for the Crimson Cage is it is a reimagining of William Shakespeare's Macbeth set against the backdrop of 1980s
Right.
pro wrestling. It tells the story of Chuck Frenzy, who is the main event star of a small time Louisiana promotion. And he's like a beloved local hero, but a big fish in a small pond. And he's not really content with his lot in life. And then he has a fateful encounter with a trio of terrifying supernatural beings out in the bayou who tell him that he's destined to become the next world champion. And as it so happens, the current world champion shows up in the territory to work a few dates and have a few matches. And Chuck realizes that he has the chance to make his destiny come true, but he's going to have to do something terrible to make that happen. And then things get increasingly crazy from there.
So now we're getting into Macbeth.
Yeah. I don't want to spoil a 400-year-old story,
exactly.
but
So if you guys, if anyone knows Macbeth now, Macbeth is one of my favorite playwrights that I've read. I don't really talk about other mediums other than comics here on the channel, but when I was in high school, I was big into Shakespeare for some weird reason.
A lot of kids don't like it, but I loved it.
Yeah, I was like, we were forced to read this, and I kind of geeked out about it. Like, I love medieval times. I know it wasn't medieval, but it was more Renaissance. It was more Renaissance. But I love kind of like that older setting and just the way that they thought, where their governments are structured.
I mean, I think a lot of people have the wrong idea about Shakespeare. They think that, like, Oh, it's that weird stuffy thing with like they speak funny and like it's dead boring. But it's all
But
about how people forget that Shakespeare isn't really meant to be read; it's meant to be performed. And
right,
for example, I had a class and I remember like in school, it was the last class on a Friday afternoon, and this teacher was like this old man, and he refused to let anybody else read the play because he thought he'd get it wrong. So he would sit and he'd read every single part in a monotone like
yeah.
this. We are
Oh,
now
you
going
can't
to
do
talk
that,
about
man. You gotta be
Hamlet.
animated when you're
And
reading
it's like,
Shakespeare.
to be or not to be. That is the and then it cranked the heating up to like the top like level, and everyone in the I think I slept through all of Hamlet that year. Like I was like in the back,
Oh, Hamlet's a good one.
like,
Hamlet's a
like,
good one. I think
but
that's in like the
then
top.
I rediscovered Hamlet at university. I saw it performed as a play, and I thought this is great. It's funny. It's like like witty. Like the dialogues
Oh,
played back
Hamlet
and
was
forth.
awesome, man.
Yeah, and
Hamlet's
it's
awesome.
really compelling when you get into it. And like Macbeth, thankfully I loved that from like I was a kid because
Macbeth was my favorite. Macbeth was
yeah,
my
like
favorite.
I was a horror loving weirdo even as a kid, and like so I like remember it was like the first year of like high school, and like Macbeth was the text for that year, and that was a more interesting class where everyone was playing the parts and stuff, and
Right.
we're really kind of getting into the story, and I thought this is like a horror movie. It's got like witches and ghosts and decapitations and violence. And yeah, no, like I was all about Macbeth. I loved it. And that kind of love has always stayed with me.
Right. I thought I still had my Macbeth book. So this might be a little bit of an embarrassing story. So one of our high school projects, I was in this research class. We had to perform a scene from a Shakespeare play at the theater, and the theme was Macbeth, and we were given a specific scene to perform from it. But we had to make our own twist. Well, my class was full of predominant women who were not nice. So they wanted to pitch it like a whole sorority thing. Imagine Macbeth, but with a sorority thing. So all the roles were reversed, and I ended up being Mr. Lady Macbeth for some reason.
Mr. Lady Macbeth.
And it was the scene. It was the scene where Macbeth turns, right, or Lady Macbeth turns on everyone,
Yeah.
right, before she goes on her killing spree. So
Yeah.
the other person who is Macbeth or Mrs. Sir Macbeth or whatever, however you want to say it, right?
Yeah, I've got you. I've got
I
you.
did not like this person. I did not like this person at all. So when I got to the part where I got to yell at her, I was like, this is like my junior year at this point. So it's like 3 years of not liking this person just coming to my head in front of everyone. I was like, this is awesome.
It actually
I
reminds
loved
me
it.
of
It was the
like I remember
penultimate
back when
scene.
I was in
Yeah, yeah,
school, I had to do it because I did drama in school as well, and it was like we had like a module we had to like for the chat I had to like do direct. I think it was acting or I was directing. I think, but I was acting as well, and like I had to direct a scene from Midsummer Night's Dream, and it was like a
That's a
scene
good,
with like.
yes.
Yeah, and it was like I was playing bottom, and it was assuming like bottom, and all the actors are like performing the play, and rather than using other drama students, I went out and got all of my friends, none of whom were actors whatsoever, and I got them to be like the actors, and because none of them could act, they were all like
Yeah.
bad actors, but it worked for that scene,
Just improv,
because
just right off the cuff, man. Just go for it.
but we had so much fun doing it, and we laughed so much doing it. And I think that really made me appreciate how much fun is in that when you get to interpret it and perform it and think of different ways of doing it. And that, like going back to Macbeth, that's one of the great things about it. You can do it when it's set in a sorority, or like you can do it like Throne of Blood, where it's like set in like feudal Japan
Right.
with samurai, or you can do it like the Crimson Cage, where it's like set in 1980s pro wrestling. That's the great thing about Shakespeare. Like it's so versatile and adaptable. I bet you, if we're to talk to somebody who says they don't like Shakespeare, odds are they have seen and liked a movie that was a Shakespeare
Midsummer's Night's
adaptation. They
Dream.
didn't know it.
It's Steven Spielberg's directing the movie. You're gonna
Yeah,
like that movie. I'm telling
yeah,
you.
exactly. Or like maybe they've seen 10 Things I Hate About You and didn't know that it was an
Yeah,
adaptation
yeah.
of like Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew. It's like there's like so many great movies out there, and like they're timeless stories. And
Yeah,
yeah, I
they
think
can
like
be told in such a modern way. I think like the biggest thing about Macbeth that I love is it kind of has that warrior spirit, or it kind of has a certain loyalty to it, right? Or else you're gonna
yeah,
get killed. It's like if you're not loyal to me, I'm gonna turn around and kill you. I don't care, right?
yeah,
And it's kind of like friendship. A big theme in that book is friendship is a two-way street, and if you go to deceive somebody, it's coming back around to bite you.
yeah.
So I'm really hoping we see some of that later on in Crimson Cage, tying it
Oh
all
yeah,
back.
no, definitely you're gonna see
I
like as I
love
say, like
stories of like that kind of deception because you get attached to a relationship and then it goes the other way. I'm like, that's awesome.
Yeah, no, like for me, like that's the like for me, like everyone talks about like Macbeth. The big damning moment for Macbeth is when he kills like the king. But for me, I think the damning moment for Macbeth is like when he turns on his best friend, Banquo, because
Yeah,
Banquo was happy for his lot in life. He has no suspicion of Macbeth. He thinks that I'm happy to not be king. If you want to be king, good for you. I'm happy for you. But Macbeth's not happy. He's thinking, no, there's something not right. I'm no pleased with what I've got. I want what you've got as well. And it kind of festers. And I
right.
think that's kind of fascinating dynamic.
100%. I never thought I'd be on a stream with anyone geeking out about Shakespeare because
Welcome to the Shakespeare King podcast.
But yeah, I would have never thought that. So I'm really grateful to have this because not a lot of people know that I like Shakespeare. I don't think I've ever told anyone that I like Shakespeare. So
Shakespeare's great.
it's great. It's funny because throughout high school, whenever like we would do Shakespeare plays, or like whenever we'd read it in class every year, we'd do like a scene every year, like full on. I would always like do the lead, but I never did theater. I never got into it because I was into sports, and that was a whole extracurricular activity that's caused so many injuries, and it's just so. But if I could redo it, I would have definitely gone the theater route because everyone says like
experiencing Shakespeare from a theatre perspective is so different from experiencing it from
right.
like a reading perspective. You really see how alive these stories become. Like
Right.
like Much Ado About Nothing as well. That's
Right.
another one that I just think is hilarious and just
Right.
chatting. And like I'll give you some homework actually after like you're done this podcast, this video show. Go and hire Kenneth Branagh's like 1994, Much Ado About Nothing. That movie is still laugh out loud funny and charming and so witty and so well written even now. Much Ado About Nothing it's called.
Yeah. What's really funny is everyone tries to recommend me movies or says go watch this, right? We actually have a movie segment on Weekly Wrap Up where, because I don't watch a lot of movies, I like movies, I just don't have the time to watch them.
Yeah, no,
so my friend forced me to watch movies, right, by making a movie segment on my own show. It's like Brandon watches movies and gives amateurish reviews that'll eventually get better in 2 years. So what did I just watch? Just watched Step Brothers for the first time. That was fine. I watched what else I watched? I just watched Snowpiercer. That was good.
Oh, that's a good movie.
I love Snowpiercer.
Yeah.
For another show that we do that I was on, we had to watch The Faculty, which I didn't know that was a horror movie when I watched it.
Here's a funny little bit of trivia for you. The Faculty was
like a love letter to...
Yeah. But The Faculty was the first movie I ever bought on DVD.
Oh no way!
Yeah.
No way! I'll send you the link after we're done. I'll DM it to you so you can watch the stream if you're interested. But
memories.
But so what was really your biggest inspiration? We're tying everything back full circle. I like to do that sometimes. Yeah. Is your love for Macbeth, also your love for wrestling. Was that like an idea you've had bottled up forever?
Oh yeah, like it was one of these things where it was like I've talked about this, but other books I've done like developing a comic idea or any idea, I guess, really is rarely like it comes to you fully formed. It's often like you'll think of something, then you'll put it in a file for later on, then something else will come along and you combine them together and it becomes the thing. But in this case, going way back to the start of my career, like I'm talking like when I did like the Standard in like 2010 or whatever. I've always wanted to do a story set in the world of like the 1980s pro wrestling territories. I've always been a wrestling fan, but to be honest, like I was a 90s kid, so like I got into wrestling in the 1990s, like Bret Hart and stuff like this. So like the 1980s was a little before my time. But I was still fascinated about that era as I got older. Like looking back into it, it was a really fascinating period of American history. It was like just at the cusp of like the territory system like dying out. It's like WWE and WWF at the time like took over and became this big global conglomerate that kind of like swallowed up all the competition. And like so it was like this kind of like little like glimmering light shining at its brightest just before it was about to get snuffed out. I think that's really kind of fascinating. So I very specifically set this book in 1984, which was the year before the first WrestleMania. I think like I always thought that would be a really fascinating like time period to tell a story. I just didn't know what the story would be, so I kind of just like set it aside for a good few years and just let it percolate. Then like fast forward to like 2015, and I watched the Justin Kurzel 2015 Macbeth with Michael Fassbender in it, and I thought it was excellent, and it reignited my old kind of like childhood love of Macbeth. I thought it was
Right.
brilliant and scary and atmospheric, action packed, and just really good. And like I started like that was when I first kind of started firing off the inspiration. And shortly after that, I saw Throne of Blood, which is like the Japanese samurai Akira Kurosawa adaptation of it, which has become one of my all-time favorite movies. I've watched this over and over and obsessed with it. It's just so good. And watching that, I was thinking like, you know, oh, that's so genius that they did like Macbeth, like set like, you know, with Japan, video Japan with samurai. What would my version of Macbeth be? And then like the old idea of like the wrestling thing, like, you know, came out, and I was like, that goes together so well.
Right.
And I started, and then once I started thinking of that, like the idea started firing off like rapid fire. I can do this and I can do this, and like, you know, like, and then it just became this whole thing. And I thought this fits together perfectly. And like, for me, I don't always. I mean, I think like I'm not going to be like modest. Like I think I'm a pretty good writer when it comes to actual stories, but usually I'm terrible at pitching comics. Like I can never come up with a kind of like tidy pitch. But this just felt like, you know, you say that in one sentence, like, you know, Macbeth, 1980s wrestling, and immediately someone knows if they're going to want to read that or not. Like it's a really clear pitch, and I thought this is so cool. Like I started thinking this whole world of like Shakespearean wrestling adaptations, because the two worlds feel like they shouldn't connect together, but they connect perfectly when you actually think about it. And so yeah, I ended up getting really excited about it, and then like I was talking to Alex Cormack, the artist. You know, we just finished working on the second. It was the second volume of Sync. That would have been the first volume at the time. And I was saying I have this great idea, but I don't have an artist for it. And he's like, I'll draw it. And that's perfect. Now, so this is going back to like 2018. The first kind of concept sketches of the characters were coming in. And then it was just like this project that. This is why this week's such a big deal for me, because like going back to like 2018, this was a project where it was like, I want this book to exist, like, you know, and the only way it's going to exist, you know, is if I write it. And like, and I just wasn't going to be happy until this was out there in the world, because like this is like a dream book of mine. It's a story that really excites me. I actually couldn't believe that nobody else had done it before I did it. I was terrified. It's been in the past couple of years terrified someone was going to beat me to it. But
so if anyone would like a really simple version of the pitch, I would say if you like Murder Falcon, read this, because it definitely has, I would say, a lot of inspiration for like a passion for a specific genre. Daniel Warren Johnson loves rock. He loves wrestling, so he combined the two. John Lee loves Macbeth and loves wrestling and combined the two. So,
and then, even beyond wrestling, the interesting thing is like I was looking 1984 as a time period that, you know, like that whole aesthetic of like the kind of neon reds and blues, and like, you know, it's just really visually interesting for a comic as well.
Right. I mean, you were 84 was a weird time. It was like right before the Cold War came back, or like kind of like the Cold War came back.
It's like it was a real time of change. I think
it was like an unspoken competition time. I wasn't alive then, but
and you had like, you know, just in terms of like, you know, the movies that were coming out at that time as well, like, you know, like your RoboCops and your Terminators.
Oh, I definitely was.
You know, it was just like a cultural kind of like and MTV was just taking off, like, you know, so like it's just like a real kind of interesting kind of snapshot of history. But yeah, I just spotted, like, I'm looking at your questions in here. I think someone just said, as someone who aspires to be a writer.
I was just about to highlight that. As someone who aspires to be a writer, I'm interested on your journey to write comics. A long day. Cannot talk anymore, guys. How did you break into the comics world?
Right. Someone said this to me, and I'm saying it to all of you. You know, it's like we receive passed down wisdom, whatever, like, you know, or nonsense, if you want to call it. But for me, like, I don't really think of myself. I don't think you really break into, like, you know, comics. Like, comics isn't like, you know, a big like glass screen you shatter through and you're in comics. For me, it's like comics is like a big massive house full of lots of like locked doors, and you're constantly doing lots of like little breaks. That you're breaking through one door and getting a little bit further in, and you're breaking through another one, you get a little bit further in. Like, you know, where like it's all just a case of like bit by bit, like the next job kind of hopefully gets you a bit closer. And for me, like, how I first got into comics was a friend of mine who was an artist who wanted to draw a comic, and he asked if I would write the script for them. And I wrote a script which was the standard of my superhero comic I did back in first started working on it in 2009. And after I wrote the script, the artist friend was like, "Oh, I can't draw that." So they said, "Good luck with that." And I ended up taking it to an editor who really loved the idea, and we developed it together, and then we ended up releasing it in shops. It didn't really make much of a splash. It was kind of like a pretty small book. But then my next comic, and then Emily Was Gone, that was a bigger hit. And what happens generally, like how you for me, one of the hardest things about breaking into comics is you have to be patient, and you can't let yourself
Right.
be discouraged. You can't you can't expect the first issue of your first book to be a massive hit. You kind of have to kind of get your name out there. You have to get a body of work behind you. You have to go to shows, go to cons, sell stuff at tables, but, often funding it yourself, and building up a library of books. And the more you make stuff yourself, the more publishers will pay attention and go, "Oh, you're not just going up to a publisher. You're not just going to Image Comics and saying hi, I really want to make comics. It's my dream to make comics." It's everybody's dream to make comics. You hear that all the time. But if you can say, "Hi, I'm the guy that made this comic and this comic, and I've proven that I can tell a story from beginning to end, and I have the commitment to tell a full story," then maybe they'll start taking you more seriously.
Right.
And I like to joke that I've been in comics now long enough that editors feel they have to reply to me to say no, which is rather than just being ignored, and then but that's a good step, even if you get close enough, because for the longest time the most discouraging thing isn't rejections, it's being ignored. If you put together a pitch and then it just gets ignored, it goes in the slush pile. But if you get an editor that's interested enough in you, and they recognize your name from your credits that you've done before, and they go, "Oh, I'm going to have to look at his pitch," and then they
Right.
look at it and they get back to you, even if they say no,
They're
that is
looking at your
progress.
name, right?
Yeah, that is progress. And for me, that's an opportunity. If you get a rejection on a pitch, if you reply back and say, "Thank you so much for your time, I really appreciate the response, I'll be in touch again in future," that does a lot more than going and flouncing on
Right.
Twitter and saying "These hack editors, what do they know? I'm a
Right.
genius. How dare they turn me down?" Or just not replying at all. I think everything's an opportunity, and I think you just have to realize that it's a marathon, not a sprint. If you're
100%.
willing to dedicate years to kind of putting in the work, then maybe it'll pay off in the end.
100%. I think that's a great capping point right there. Nailed it right on the head. Now, everybody who is interested in HOTELL, make sure you go back, pick up the trade, contact your LCS, make them order it, make them reorder it. It's worth it. So you can pick up the next issue, or I think that it's also a very welcoming jumping on point where you don't necessarily need the first volume. However, if you feel inclined, I would highly recommend it. Also, read Crimson Cage that I have on my phone, but make sure you get it physically, just like I will, because they're worth it. Look at John Pose, and make sure you get those books. Also, watch more movies than me, and make sure you guys check out all the content that we have to offer here on Whiplash Wednesday. Coming up on this channel, Creators Corner. I think we're going to take a break for the rest of 2021. We're hitting hard 2022 with a lot of guests that I've announced.
We ended 2021 in a high, which was good.
Yes. Yes, it was awesome. It was awesome. The month of December was fantastic. We had Marv Wolfman, Jim Shooter, and now you on. So we had 3 superstars. So, and then starting off 2022, we have Roy Thomas coming to the channel, which is going to be really exciting. We have King in Black, which we are recording tonight. We're going to be dropping that on Friday, so look out for that. Also, if you guys are interested in checking out our top 10 MCU movies that we were tagged in, we did that. Came out today, 1 o'clock, so click that replay. But other than that, John, thank you so much for your time. I had a blast talking to you, man.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed chatting to you as well.
For sure, man. We will do this again anytime you want to come back on the
Yeah,
show.
next time I've got a book coming out, send me an invite and I'll come along and say hello. Tell you a bit more Shakespeare, please.
Yes, we'll talk Shakespeare for sure. IGI Station.
Come be the guest on my Shakespeare podcast coming soon.
Oh, yeah. Shakespeare podcast with John Lees. Let's do this. All right, you guys. Take care. Be safe. Happy Wednesday.